This image is sold on every postcard in the world. Gondolas gliding across the water's surface against a backdrop of graceful bridges. A symbol of eternal romance, frozen in its pristine beauty. It seems as though this watery labyrinth was created solely for aesthetic pleasure. Millions of people come here for the illusion of time standing still. They see magnificent palaces hovering above the emerald waters of narrow canals. No one stops to think about what supports this heavy marble.
The outward grace blinds the viewer, making them forget the basic laws of physics.
But this flawless picture hides a brutal physical anomaly. The city isn't floating on water. It is methodically and continuously sinking. Beneath the painted facades lies the infrastructure of a ceaseless, centuries-old catastrophe. Every building wages an invisible, exhausting struggle for survival. Moisture corrodes the load-bearing structures with every passing second of this place's existence. Salt burns away the brickwork from the inside, turning it to dust. Foundations sink under the relentless pressure of their own gigantic mass. Buildings creak, splitting along internal seams invisible to the eye. This is not merely a collection of beautiful palaces and churches. It is a gigantic, desperate experiment in survival against the laws of nature. A mechanism that has been teetering on the brink of complete physical destruction for centuries.
A system that devours colossal resources to preserve its outward appearance.
Behind every monument lies an exhausting, unprecedented engineering compromise. Architecture here serves not art, but a stark defense against an aggressive environment. Water is not a backdrop, but a cruel, methodical, and merciless enemy. And this enemy never sleeps. By the end of this journey, it will become clear why this impossible architecture took precisely this form. You will understand the price paid for every stone raised above sea level. The illusion of lightness will vanish forever. Only the bare, merciless anatomy of survival will remain. For now, we must return to absolute emptiness, to the moment when there was nothing here but cold, piercing fog, back to the murky water and the sticky, foul-smelling silt, to the point where the instinct for self-preservation forced people to step right into the swamp. The ground here was unsuitable for a person to walk on. The lagoon was a viscous mixture of salt water, sand, and rotting organic matter. No one in their right mind would have built even a temporary military camp here. This territory rightfully belonged only to the seagulls and the tides, but the first settlers simply had no other choice. On the solid ground of the mainland, their former homes were burning under the onslaught of the barbarians. Fleeing into the swamps was the only available way to survive the attacks of the continental armies.
People consciously traded solid ground for malaria-ridden, lifeless shoals.
The fear of imminent death proved stronger than the fear of a merciless nature. The refugees landed on tiny islands of dry land, tightly wedged among the water. These were pitiful patches of mud, barely protruding above the surface at low tide. No one thought of building a city back then. The only concern was finding a place to sleep. It was physically impossible to lay a classic stone foundation here. Any heavy block would instantly and irrevocably sink into the quagmire under its own weight. The usual logic of continental construction simply did not work here. They had to invent a new architectural physics from scratch. People began to tame the mud, desperately transforming it into something resembling dry land. They wove large baskets from flexible osier and marsh reeds. These containers were tightly packed with broken bricks, gravel, and sticky clay.
The city emerged as an artificial mound of rubble amidst endless tides.
Every inch of land was wrested from the sea through grueling, back-breaking labor. Men stood knee-deep in icy water, reinforcing the crumbling banks with wooden stakes. The damp cold penetrated to the bone, causing fever and a swift death. But returning to shore was even more dangerous. Survival depended directly on the ability to adapt to the constant, pervasive dampness. The first houses were light huts made of woven branches and dry straw. They were not heavy enough to critically compress the unstable ground. It was the architecture of desperation, designed with no thought for durability. But time passed, and the deadly threat on the mainland did not disappear. The temporary, pitiful shelter was bound to turn into a permanent fortress. The settlers needed something far more substantial than huts on shaky silt. Thus was born the idea for the craziest construction project in human history. The problem of weight became the settlers' greatest enemy and their worst nightmare. To erect even a light hut on the swamp, the unstable bottom had to be stabilized. The solution was the most massive and ruthless destruction of the continental forests. People began driving tree trunks directly into the underwater mud. Millions of wooden piles pierced the bottom of the lagoon, forming an incredibly dense grid. They were driven in by hand with heavy sledgehammers, standing waist-deep in icy water for hours on end.
Larch, oak, and alder became the invisible, deep foundation of the future empire.
Thousands of straight, sturdy trunks were used for a single small house. The forests of Dalmatia and Slovenia were cut down to the roots solely for this project. Huge rafts were floated down fast-flowing rivers straight to the salty coast. Wood instantly became the main strategic resource for survival. Without it, any brick structure would simply sink into the gray sludge. Underwater, the wood was bound to rot within a few short years. But in the lagoon's marshes, an unexpected, life-saving physical phenomenon occurred. Viscous, ultra-dense clay completely blocked oxygen from reaching the trunks. Without air, decay-causing bacteria simply could not break down the organic tissue. At the same time, the aggressive salt water began to slowly soak through the wood. Minerals from the seawater densely filled every cell of the dead wood. A remarkable chemical transformation took place, permanently altering the structure of the material.
The wood didn't just survive, it literally turned into super strong stone.
The longer these piles remained underwater, the stronger they became. Their tips dug firmly into the hard layer of continental clay several meters deep. The tops were cut flat to a single level for laying horizontal wooden decking. On this platform, it was already possible to safely erect lightweight walls. An entire petrified forest still reliably supports thousands of tons of architecture. More than 1 million piles were driven into the ground for the Church of Santa Maria della Salute alone. This is an invisible, silent support without which the city would collapse in a matter of hours. The entire weight of the stone is transferred to the water exclusively through these wooden spikes. The builders never saw the results of their colossal labor. Everything was hidden beneath the dark water. They worked practically blind, relying on experience and the force of each blow. The price of the slightest mistake was fatal. A misalignment would inevitably lead to collapse. But this invisible forest proved stronger than the continental granite itself. Even on such a reinforced foundation, it was impossible to erect solid monoliths. Every building was designed with a maniacal calculation of every extra kilogram. Architects used exclusively hollow bricks instead of dense building stone. Walls were made as thin as possible to critically reduce the overall load on the piles. The marble we see today is a gleaming, expensive visual illusion. It consists only of the thinnest decorative slabs attached to a lightweight brick framework. The buildings appeared incredibly massive, but were essentially almost empty inside.
It was a theatrical set of gigantic, unprecedented national scale.
Istrian stone was used only where water came into direct contact with the wall. This ultra-dense limestone prevented seawater from penetrating the porous brickwork. It functioned as a waterproof barrier, not as a primary load-bearing support. Above the level of the deadly tide, the most extreme economy of mass began. Houses were assembled like incredibly flexible, breathable hinged mechanisms. Lime in the mortar ensured the masonry's elasticity during inevitable settlement. If builders had used rigid cement, the luxurious facades would have cracked immediately. The buildings were able to deform along with the constant movement of the underwater silt. The floors between levels were made exclusively of light and durable wood. The interior walls were constructed of reeds plastered with a thin layer of gypsum. Everything obeyed a single ironclad law: minimum weight with maximum volume. Gravity was always the chief and most demanding architect of this space. The exterior radiated unshakable monumentality and a defiant, ostentatious wealth. But inside, it was an extremely strange system of constant engineering compromises. The city wore a heavy mask, carefully concealing its fragile anatomy beneath it. The balance between mass and buoyancy was maintained at the very limit of physical possibility. Deep cracks appeared regularly on the facades, but they were quickly and neatly patched up. The city was constantly in a grueling state of hidden repairs and reconstructions.
Any additional superstructure required emergency reinforcement of the pile field beneath it.
Architecture here was not a free art, but the strict mathematics of survival. The illusion of indestructible strength worked flawlessly on foreign ambassadors and merchants. None of the guests saw the wooden beams and hollow walls behind the thick gilding. Venice successfully sold the image of an eternal stone island in the midst of a raging sea, and the whole world willingly bought into this magnificent, flawlessly executed engineering lie. The absence of familiar soil dictated the harshest sanitary and living conditions. There were physically no underground sources of clean, fresh water in the city. All around, only the toxic, salt-saturated sludge of the lagoon lapped at the shore. The survival of tens of thousands of people depended entirely on every millimeter of rainfall. Every city square became a giant engineering funnel for collecting rainwater. Deep, completely watertight clay reservoirs were dug beneath the stone paving. They were filled with river sand to naturally filter the moisture falling from the sky. The system functioned as a giant filter, ingeniously integrated into the city. Water slowly flowed down the slopes of the square into special stone wells. Every drop was carefully collected, purified by sand, and stored as a precious resource. Access to these wells was strictly and ruthlessly controlled by the Republic's authorities. Deliberate contamination of a freshwater source was punishable by immediate death without trial. No less acute was the problem of daily disposal of human waste. In conditions of extremely dense development, a traditional underground sewer system was physically impossible. Digging cesspools in the marsh made no practical or sanitary sense. The city used the lagoon itself as a vast, fail-safe, natural purification mechanism. Sewage pipes led from the houses directly into the water of the canals beneath the palace windows. Twice a day, the tides washed the sewage far out into the open sea. The Adriatic functioned as a giant pump, cleansing the city's clogged arteries. This biological rhythm was a fundamental matter of collective life and death. If the water circulation had stopped, the city would have instantly drowned in sewage and epidemics. Cholera and the plague were constant neighbors, eagerly awaiting the slightest engineering error. Architecture and hydrology functioned as a single organism, critically dependent on one another. Humans had completely and unconditionally subordinated their daily lives to the gravitational cycles of the moon. In winter, the canals were covered with a thin crust of ice, completely paralyzing freight traffic. In summer, at low tide, rotting silt was exposed, exuding an unbearable, nauseating stench. It was a harsh, intensely physical world, far removed from elegant, romantic poetry. Beauty was merely an accidental byproduct of harsh, daily utilitarianism. Every day demanded colossal collective efforts simply to maintain the status quo. The city did not relax for a single second in its endless struggle against the environment. Life here was an exhausting mechanism requiring constant attention and lubrication, and yet the system worked, astonishing even the most skeptical contemporaries. As unprecedented commercial power grew, the ambitions of the inhabitants changed rapidly. Simple brick warehouses no longer satisfied the unimaginably wealthy merchants. Power demanded monumental, overwhelming visual confirmation of its new status. New incredible masses of stone began to press down on the fragile pile fields. Barges carrying heavy lead for domes and roofs flowed into the lagoon in a continuous stream. Giant bell towers were built, inherently incompatible with the marshy ground. The famous Campanile di San Marco became a monstrous concentrator of blind, dead weight. Thousands of tons of brick soared into the sky, supported by invisible, slender splinters. The city began to physically overload its original, extremely modest infrastructure. Canals designed for light boats were filled with heavy merchant galleys. Waves from their enormous hulls began methodically eroding the brickwork of the old foundations. Vanity gradually overcame the primal instinct for engineering self-preservation. Each new generation added its own thick layer of decorative, useless stone. The palazzos were covered with heavy ornamentation and incredibly massive marble balconies. The city gradually turned into an overcrowded stone sack, suffocating under its own weight. Gravity began its slow, invisible, yet absolutely inevitable process of retribution. The wooden piles, which had served flawlessly for centuries, began to bear excessive loads. The buildings began to lean menacingly, forever losing their perfect vertical geometry. The luxurious floors in the palaces buckled in waves due to the uneven settling of the foundations. Mass became the chief enemy of the very wealth that had created it. The famous campanile ultimately could not withstand its own incredible imperial weight. At the beginning of the 20th century, it simply collapsed in on itself with a deafening crash. The tower turned into a huge mountain of broken brick right in the main square. It was a brutal reminder that the laws of physics know no mercy. The tower was fully restored, but the message was clear. The system was overloaded to the limit. The city's body could no longer bear the weight of the architectural ambitions placed upon it. The constant demand for luxury was slowly killing the very foundation of physical survival. Engineering could no longer keep pace with the desires of a political elite that had lost all sense of restraint. Every new grandiose building became an act of architectural violence against the ground. Wealth had turned into a leaden belt around the neck of a drowning man. The city had become a hostage to its own unparalleled economic success, and the cruel price for that success lay hidden just below the surface of the murky water. The geography of the shallow lagoon had never been a fixed, static entity. Rivers from the mainland constantly carried tons of sand and fertile silt. This continuous process threatened to permanently fill the waterways with solid ground. The city could lose its main defense and ultimately merge with the continental landmass. The Republic's engineers resorted to unprecedented interference with the natural environment. They forcibly altered the courses of the largest continental rivers throughout the entire region. Powerful water flows were diverted dozens of kilometers away from the lagoon. This halted the silting but permanently disrupted the ancient ecological balance. The lagoon was abruptly deprived of its natural replenishment with fresh, life-sustaining sediments. The bottom began to deepen rapidly, and the waves began to crash more aggressively against the unprotected shores. The sea gradually reclaimed the water space, now deprived of the river's barrier. In an attempt to save itself from turning into dry land, the city catastrophically accelerated its own flooding. Rough human intervention triggered a chain reaction of ecological degradation. The salinity of the water rose sharply, permanently killing the unique flora of the life-saving shoals. The protective sandbars eroded under the relentless blows of brutal winter storms. The system lost its ability to self-repair and began to require constant maintenance. Nature desperately tried to restore everything to its original, natural state. Humans were forced to build kilometer-long stone breakwaters to protect against the waves. Each new wall caused a shift in currents, demanding the immediate construction of the next wall. It was an endless battle, devouring colossal financial and human resources. The city had finally shifted from adapting to nature to waging war against it. The canals had to be constantly dredged to remove sand washed in by the sea. Tons of silt were hauled away by barges, deepening the riverbed to allow modern ships to pass. The balance had become entirely artificial, dependent solely on the daily labor of machines. Any halt to this work would mean an immediate and irreversible natural disaster. Without human intervention, the lagoon would have completely disappeared within a few decades. The city became a prisoner of its own engineering ingenuity and boundless arrogance. It survived as a unique political project, but died as part of the ecosystem. The scale of the problem grew to national and then global proportions. Local authorities could no longer cope with the pressure of the sea on their own. Nature struck with increasing frequency, methodically breaching the defenses created by engineers. And one day those defenses were completely and devastatingly shattered. The illusion of control finally collapsed in November 1966. A powerful cyclone trapped the water in the northern part of the Adriatic Sea. The wind physically prevented the gigantic tide from flowing back into the open ocean. The water level rose nearly 2 meters above the historical critical mark. The city was instantly plunged into an icy black, salt-saturated abyss. Oil from ruptured heating tanks mixed with sewage that had risen to the surface. This toxic, greasy film completely covered the marble floors of ancient churches and palaces. Water stood in the grand halls for days on end, methodically destroying the ancient masonry. Residents found themselves trapped on the upper floors without electricity, communication, or heat. Rescue boats sailed right over the parapets of bridges without their hulls touching them. This was not just a flood. It was a demonstration of the ocean's absolute power. Human engineering proved utterly powerless against the abnormal concentration of the elements. When the sea finally receded, a catastrophic, terrifying reality was revealed. Salt had crystallized inside the bricks, literally shattering them into fine dust. Istrian stone began flaking off the historic facades in heavy, solid slabs. For the first time in centuries, the petrified wooden piles showed serious signs of weakness. It became clear that the old methods of survival no longer worked. Industrial pumping of artesian water on the mainland had catastrophically accelerated soil subsidence. The city was rapidly sinking, while global sea levels were creeping upward. The catastrophe ceased to be a coincidence and became a cruel mathematical inevitability. The damage ran into the billions. Hundreds of priceless works of art were lost forever. The water mercilessly exposed all the hidden flaws of the city's worn-out infrastructure. The world realized that this picture-perfect postcard might vanish beneath the waves forever. An era of panic and a frantic search for global engineering solutions began. Old pumps and wooden barriers looked pitiful against the backdrop of the elements. It became necessary to admit that the city was completely defenseless against the new, aggressive climate. Floods began to recur more and more frequently, quickly becoming a new, exhausting norm. Buildings simply did not have time to dry out between the relentless blows of salt water. Every rise in water levels robbed the city of years of life and miles of brick. Living on the ground floors had become physically impossible and deadly dangerous. The water was methodically driving humans out of the space they had presumptuously claimed as their own. An intervention of unprecedented, truly planetary scale was required. Colossal budgets and the most advanced technologies were thrown into the rescue effort. Engineers developed a project of cyclopean proportions with the short name MOSE. It is an extremely complex system of 78 giant mobile gates on the seabed. These iron barriers were intended to reliably isolate the lagoon during critical high tides. Construction quickly turned into an endless, exhausting financial black hole. Billions of euros vanished over the years into corruption schemes and gross technological errors. The steel hinges of the giant underwater gates began to rust even before they were put into operation. The underwater environment proved to be significantly more aggressive than initial laboratory calculations had predicted. Work dragged on for decades, constantly accompanied by scandals and the arrests of high-ranking officials. At one point, it seemed physically impossible to bring the project to a working state. Salt and sand were destroying the mechanisms faster than they could be installed on the seabed. But the fear of losing the city forced the government to blindly continue funding the project. In the end, the system was completed and put into full operation. Huge, hollow yellow shields rise from the seabed, blocking the Adriatic waves. They create an artificial, steel pause in the natural rhythm of the tides. The city has gained a mechanical shield that completely cuts it off from the fury of the open sea. Dispatchers in protected concrete bunkers monitor pressure and wind charts. At their command, powerful compressors pump air into the sluice gates, raising them upward. This intervention looks like the absolute triumph of engineering over the blind forces of nature. Humans have learned to press a button and physically stop the advancing ocean. The squares remain dry even during the fiercest winter storms. Tourists can calmly drink coffee where meter-high waves once raged. The illusion of absolute safety has been successfully restored thanks to gigantic steel muscles. Outwardly, it seems that a centuries-old problem has been definitively and irrevocably solved forever. The mechanism allows the city to catch its breath and avoid catastrophic damage to its facades. The water obediently crashes against the barriers several kilometers from the historic center. The city no longer depends on the whims of the wind or the phases of the moon. Life has become predictable, controlled, and technologically protected. But this artificial peace came at an invisible, terrible price. The system created to save the architecture struck from a completely different angle. Every time the gates close, irreversible processes of destruction are set in motion within the lagoon itself. The cure turned out to be no less dangerous than the original disease. Every prolonged raising of the sluice gates severely disrupts the lagoon's natural respiration. Closed gates instantly halt the vital water exchange with the sea. Without tidal currents, the narrow city canals turn into stagnant sewage ditches. All sewage remains trapped inside, poisoning the enclosed water basin. The ecosystem begins to die rapidly from a catastrophic lack of dissolved oxygen. Algae rot en masse, releasing suffocating gases directly into the foundations of historic buildings. By saving the stone from flooding, the barriers kill the biological foundation of the entire area. An engineering triumph has turned into a large-scale, slow-acting ecological disaster. Moreover, global climate change is making storms increasingly frequent. The floodgates must be raised dozens of times during a single short winter season. If the gates are kept closed constantly, the city will quickly suffocate in its own waste. If they are left open, the historic buildings will be destroyed by sea salt. The rescue mechanism has trapped the ancient city in a cruel, inescapable trap. There are no good solutions left. There is only a daily choice between two kinds of death. The new high-tech form of protection has spawned its own unprecedented fragility. The city has become a complete hostage to the reliability of compressors and underwater sensors. Maintaining the system requires colossal, unending injections from the state budget. The gates are encrusted with shells, the hinges clogged with silt, and the metal subjected to severe corrosion. This is not a one-time victory. It is the beginning of an endless, costly war of attrition. The mechanism ages with every second it spends under saltwater. Fishermen complain of a complete shift in currents and the loss of their usual catch. The water in the canals changes color and odor after every prolonged closure. Nature abhors a vacuum and takes cruel revenge for the artificial steel barriers. The lagoon is slowly turning into a dead artificial lake. Scientists warn that the system's structural integrity has only decades left. When the ocean level rises another half-meter, the barriers will become completely useless. They simply won't be able to withstand the increased constant pressure of the water mass. This is merely a temporary band-aid on a bleeding artery of planetary scale. The city has bought itself time at the cost of destroying the surrounding natural environment. It survives only as an isolated capsule, completely cut off from the natural world. Engineering has saved the form, but has permanently destroyed the substance. The balance is lost forever, leaving only dependence on machines. Today, this great architectural masterpiece operates at the limit of its wear and tear. All that remains of its former imperial grandeur is a dense, sanitized tourist backdrop. For years, giant cruise ships have displaced water, destroying the fragile underwater shores. Their powerful propellers churned up toxic silt from the seabed, finishing off the old pile fields. The local population is fleeing en masse from this incredibly expensive, inconvenient museum. Families no longer live in the luxurious palazzi. Hotels operate there around the clock. Real life has been drained from these walls, replaced by a commercial, neon-lit surrogate. The infrastructure serves not the citizens, but an endless, faceless stream of onlookers. Stone facades are reinforced annually with new, hidden metal cables. Historic basements are filled with concrete in an attempt to halt the inevitable sinking into the ground. The city has become a patient in intensive care, tightly hooked up to life support systems. It does not live on its own. It is merely kept artificially conscious. Every day here is an act of physical and financial resistance against gravity. Millions of tourists' footsteps are wearing the ancient cobblestones down to a smooth, glass-like finish. Bridges are reinforced with invisible steel beams so they can bear the weight of the crowds. The city is wearing away under the gaze of those who have come to admire it. This is no longer a triumph of human reason over wild nature. It is an exhausting daily war of attrition that cannot be won in the long run. Every second of relative stability costs an incredible amount of effort, concrete, and resources. Gravity, salt, and water possess infinite patience and always know how to wait. Power here no longer belongs to the doges or the wealthy merchant guilds. True power belongs to the water and the engineers trying to stop it. Ambition has given way to panic, and the construction of new masterpieces to endless patching of holes. The system has finally closed in on its own survival for the sake of survival. The empty windows of the first floors stare at the canals like blind, boarded-up eye sockets. Nothing can be stored there anymore. The water takes any property left behind. Life has risen higher, leaving the lower tier to be devoured by black mold. Buildings are slowly amputating their own lower sections to preserve the whole. A city built out of fear of the land now trembles in fear of the sea. The circle has closed, transforming the original place of refuge into a territory of constant threat. This golden cage is slowly but surely sinking into its native element, and no wall will ever be able to stop this process. Recall that flawless image from the postcard at the very beginning. Gliding black gondolas, calm emerald water, the grandeur of frozen time. Now you know for certain that millions of dead tree trunks lie hidden beneath this mirror, that every brick wall is thoroughly saturated with salt, rot, and the fear of collapse. The city on the water has never been a miracle of light, airy grace. It is the heaviest monument to the desperate physical resistance of human will against matter. A symbol of how ambition drives an entire civilization into a cruel logical trap. A trap requiring endless, exhausting maintenance simply to preserve the status quo. The salvation of this complex structure resulted in its irreversible transformation into a lifeless mechanism. We forced the water to submit to steel shields, but we lost the living lagoon forever. Ecology was sacrificed for the sake of saving tourist routes and marble. Every decision gave birth to a new, even more complex and intractable problem. We look at the facades and habitually see a history of power and incredible wealth, but the real story lies deep below, in the cold, toxic silt. It is measured in tons of pressure, cubic meters of pumped-out water, and destroyed ecosystems. This city exists not because it is naturally resilient. It stands today only because the machine designed to save it is still running. Electricity powers the pumps, concrete seals the cracks, and the floodgates rise on command. The cost of this man-made illusion grows exponentially with every new winter flood. No one knows when budgets or technology will reach their ultimate limit. Outward stability has turned out to be the most expensive lie in the history of architecture. Large systems always have their own cruel, inevitable physical limit. Symbols survive only at the cost of a complete transformation of their original essence. The original city has long been dead, only its high-tech copy remains. The water hasn't gone anywhere. It simply continues its invisible, patient advance. It wears away stone, corrodes steel, and meekly waits for the mistakes of the lock operators. The ocean needs no maintenance. It simply obeys the laws of gravity and time. But human engineering demands eternal vigilance. Sooner or later, the balance of power will change definitively and irrevocably. No artificial barriers will hold back the rising global sea level. This grand battle was doomed to defeat from the very first stake driven into the ground. And one day, this picture-perfect postcard will inevitably and silently dissolve into the sea.